Welcome, class, and today we will be looking at the fall of the Soviet Union. So contrary to Hollywood, Rocky Balboa did not end the Soviet Union, but they did have a pretty good run for a while. As you remember, World War II was a horrible experience for the USSR. They lost at least 20 million dead. Some people claim it's up to 24 million. And their agriculture was destroyed, as well as major cities, because the Germans invaded them. Now, after this, using fear and intimidation, Stalin was able to rebuild Russia pretty quickly through his 5-year plans. As you know, the Soviet Union rivalry with the United States is just getting started in what is called the Cold War. Stalin would die in 1953 of natural causes, which starts a wonderfully weird new era of Nikita Khrushchev. You can see Khrushchev on the left. He looks like Elmer Fudd from the old Bugs Bunny cartoons. Now, Khrushchev is a farmer. He's sort of a redneck. He's not a lawyer. He's not, this government official, stereotype. He's not Stalin for sure, and he's kind of a redneck. He's sort of barbaric. He's very unpredictable. And so no one really knows what to do with Khrushchev. Khrushchev often did things that no one saw coming. He would often say something and then do the exact opposite, and so no one really knew how to take him. A good example of this is how he calls for an era of peaceful coexistence where the USA and the USSR can be rivals but not enemies. So this sounds so positive. And then he orders for more nuclear missiles to be made. You can see right here, since we're talking about nuclear missiles, just how even though the United States started out with more missiles and they developed the nuclear technology first, the Russians catch up very quickly, and look at that slope going straight up. Towards the end of the Cold War, we'll see some missile reduction treaties. However, until the 1980s, these countries are producing a lot of missiles. And there's something called mutually assured destruction, which is an understanding that if the Soviets fire their missiles at the United States will fire all their missiles at the Soviet Union, meaning both countries will destroy each other. That's not very reassuring, is it? Most famously, Khrushchev ushered in a new era in the Soviet Union called de-Stalinization, where he blamed Stalin for all of Russia's failures. Now notice he did this only after Stalin was dead. Khrushchev will also try to cut back on some of the fear that took place under Stalin's regime. So he closes the Gulag and he gives people more rights, not a lot of freedoms, but more freedoms than they had when Stalin was in charge. Well, all of this reform may sound good. It actually has a bad effect on the Soviet Union's Eastern Bloc countries. Since he's less intimidating than Stalin, the countries in Eastern Europe get more and more bold and ask for more freedoms. Two examples of this. Poland doesn't like that they can't have religious freedom as a member of a satellite state of the Soviet Union. And so they push for more religious freedoms. However, they say that they will still remain communist. So Khrushchev doesn't like this, but at the end of the day, he allows it to happen. Around the same time period, this is all in 1956, Hungary will do the same thing. However, they asked for what Poland got and then said they might move away from communism. As you can imagine, this did not go well, and they were invaded. So while it's clear that the Soviets need a new leader, it's also pretty fun to look back at the Khrushchev era. For example, in the 1950s, he goes on a trip to the United States. For one, you can never imagine Stalin being welcomed in the United States. So when he gets to the USA, he wants to see the highlights. So they take him to Iowa to a corn farm because he's obsessed with corn. They take him to California, and they show him Hollywood. And he wants to go see Disneyland. And the United States government refuses because they're afraid of a security risk, and they don't want him getting shot, of all places, at Disneyland. And he pouts. he gets all depressed. So as you can see, Khrushchev isn't a bad guy. He's just sort of a character. When he's retired in 1963, notice I said retired, meaning he didn't go into retirement. He comes back from vacation and he's told, "You have been retired." He says, "This is my greatest victory." Now, how can being fired be your greatest victory? And he goes on to explain, 10 years ago, a Soviet leader either dies in office or gets assassinated. Now, I can be fired, showing how much progress I've made. So you got to say he's looking on the bright side of life. And who replaces Khrushchev? Our old friend Leonid Brezhnev. Now, Brezhnev is sort of in between Stalin and Khrushchev. He's tougher than Khrushchev. He's more laid back than Stalin. Brezhnev also starts, you guessed it, the Brezhnev Doctrine, which would be a reason for the Soviets to invade a country if that country was communist and was threatening to move away from communism. The first time the Brezhnev Doctrine was used was in Czechoslovakia in 1968, when the Czechs are undergoing a period called Prague Spring. And this is when Czech leaders are promising more freedoms. Now note, they still want to remain communist, they just want to give people more freedoms and more rights and more choice. This is called Prague Spring because everything looks better in the spring. It's when the cold thaws out and things are beautiful and fresh again. So everyone was really excited because nobody knew what the Soviet Union would do, but it appeared they were letting the Czechs get away with this, simply because the Czechs were still going to remain communist. Now, if Khrushchev were in power, he would have been all for this. However, as you know, Brezhnev is no Khrushchev, and Brezhnev invades with Warsaw Pact soldiers. Now, the Warsaw Pact soldiers were told that you will be greeted like heroes in Prague. As you can see right here, that's not exactly the case. I sort of feel sorry for these soldiers because they're ordered to go to Prague and put down this, it's not even an uprising. It's just them questioning the Soviet rule. And look at these poor guys who are just doing their job, and they're being just cursed by these Czech citizens. I definitely feel for the Czechs, but I also feel a little sorry for the Warsaw Pact soldiers because these are just young men who are told to do this and they have to do it. All in all, the Soviet Union looks very bad around the world because the whole world is watching, and they see this is another example of the communists denying freedoms to people. The 1970s would bring us into a new era called détente, which is French for thaw or warming. So this is when it looks like the rivalry between the United States and the USSR could really sort of calm down. And there's a real possibility now of the war not ending with one side winning and one side losing, but instead with a handshake and everyone just getting along. Now you can see Brezhnev on the left and Richard Nixon on the right. And so this is a time when both countries will have a lot of meetings to try to work out some agreements. The biggest agreement is called SALT, which means Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And this is when the United States and the USSR agree to make less missiles, nuclear missiles, every year. This is a good first step. But it's not the end, is it? I mean, what are some criticisms of SALT? Again, you're making less missiles every year. Exactly. You're still making new missiles every year. You're just not making as many. And you still have missiles that you made last year. So, yes, it's better than making as many missiles as you made in the past, but it's not the end goal. Just a quick little shout out. Notice that President Ford on the left is a lefty. He knows what's up. In 1979, there is a second version of SALT called SALT II, and this is an actual improvement on SALT I. And so it actually appeared that the production of missiles would actually stop. This was signed, as you see, by both leaders. However, the United States Congress refuses to ratify it because right after they signed it, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and started doing aggressive things towards the United States. So it almost looks like the decade of the 70s, détente, was nothing more than just delaying the end of the war. Some other issues for the Soviet Union. The first is Poland. They have a hard time with Poland, as we've talked about earlier. Well, in the 1970s, there's this guy called Lech Walesa, and he leads this workers' movement called Solidarity. Now, Lech Walesa is a dock worker. He works on one of the ports in, it's called Danzig or Gdansk. And they're calling for more freedoms, especially for workers, but they're using nonviolent resistance, like our old friend Mohandas Gandhi. Why is it a bit embarrassing for workers to be protesting the Soviet Union? Exactly. The Soviet Union as a communist country is supposed to be designed for workers. So if workers are protesting it, then something is obviously wrong. This is Lech Walesa right here. Lech Walesa has a great story because he goes from being an ordinary dock worker, I believe he's also an electrician, he becomes this protest leader, and he ends up as the prime minister of his country after the fall of the Soviet Union. Quite a rise in power. At the same time, the Polish are following Lech Walesa. They're also getting some support from a guy called Karol Wojtyla, a name you probably don't know. However, when he becomes Pope, we all call him Pope John Paul II, who was just given his sainthood just a few weeks ago. So between Pope John Paul II protesting lack of religious freedoms and Lech Walesa, a dock worker, protesting a lack of workers' rights, this really makes the Soviet Union look bad. Here's Pope John Paul II right here. As you may know, John Paul II was almost assassinated in the early 80s. And evidence shows us that the Soviet Union probably ordered that assassination attempt. They didn't like that he was spreading bad news about the Soviet Union around the world. You gotta think, assassinating the Pope, probably not the best way to get into heaven. After all this talk and rhetoric and all these threats, the last era starts when a new president of the United States is elected called Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is a unique figure, and he's pretty much at the perfect place at the perfect time because he's a former Hollywood actor. So he knows how to deal with the Soviet Union. He knows how to posture. He knows how to give speeches. He knows how to look tough and look mean. And so he is really what the United States need at this crucial time. And he starts his presidency with really a Winston Churchill moment, and he calls the Soviet Union the evil empire because they deny their people basic freedoms and rights. So just like détente seemed to be this period of mutual respect, this is the last era of evil empire, and he just calls them out as soon as his presidency begins. Here's Ronald Reagan in one of his Hollywood roles before he got into politics. And this is his most famous role for all you Notre Dame fans. And he plays George Gipp, a player who is very ill and who would eventually die. And he tells Newt Rockne, the Fighting Irish coach, to tell his story to his team when his team needs to hear it.
George. Yes, Rock. George, this telegram just arrived from Walter Camp. You've been named fullback on his All-American team.
Me? You wouldn't kid me, Rock.
No, it's on the level. You're gonna be all right, kid.
I haven't got a complaint in the world, Rock. I'm not afraid. What's tough about this? Rock, someday when the team's up against it, breaks are beating the boys, ask them to go in there with all they've got. Win just one for the Kipper. I don't know where I'll be then, but I'll know about it. I'll be happy.
If you've seen the movie Rudy, there's a famous scene when Rudy Rudiger is quoting that speech. Incredible stuff. Another thing Reagan does right when he comes into office, he actually orders more nuclear missiles to be made. Now, he got a lot of criticism for this because this sounds really, really dangerous. What he was doing was he was testing the Soviet economy because he knew they couldn't keep up. So he would make all these missiles knowing they then had to make the missiles, and then guess what he did? He called for missile reductions. And so with this, it was like they've been working so hard just to make all these missiles, and now the United States wants to destroy missiles. And so he's playing mind games and head games with the Soviet Union. Now, Reagan had some friends in doing this. This is probably his toughest ally. Her name is Margaret Thatcher. She was Prime Minister of England. They called her the Iron Lady because she was so tough. She's also the first and only female Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. In 1985, Reagan finally gets someone that he can work with, and that's when the USSR appoints a very young General Secretary called Mikhail Gorbachev. To give you some context here, most General Secretaries in the past 5 or 6 years when they've come to power have been in their 80s. Gorbachev is in his 40s. Further, he's actually educated. He has a college degree. He even has an advanced degree because he's a lawyer. He is the first Soviet General Secretary since Vladimir Lenin to have graduated from college. And this is Gorbachev right here. Now, we should think of Gorbachev sort of as a Khrushchev 2.0. He's a reformer, and he launches 2 big programs called Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost means openness, and this is when Gorbachev is pledging for less corruption, more political choice, more transparency, and he even proves this by, towards the end of his career, he actually runs for election. Can you imagine anyone else doing this before Gorbachev? I don't think so. The second thing he does is called perestroika, which translates to restructuring. And this is when he tries to create a new market-based economy, sort of like what China did. He wants to keep communism, however, he sees that the economy that they have is failing. President Reagan was able to give one of his most famous speeches in 1987 when he went to Berlin to send Mikhail Gorbachev a message.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Just like with Khrushchev, since Gorbachev was trying to be nicer, a lot of people in Eastern Europe took advantage of this and called for more changes. One of the things that put a lot of stress on the end of the USSR was when the Berlin Wall fell. Now, as you remember, the Berlin Wall was built by East Germany to keep East Germans in East Berlin and to prevent them from going to West Berlin. Well, in 1989, there was an announcement that there would be a temporary crossing allowed, but this was meant to be a one-time thing and very, very temporary. However, the way that it was announced, it said that anyone who wants to cross from East Berlin to West Berlin may immediately. And so literally hundreds of thousands of people in East Berlin run for the borders and they cannot be stopped. And so this begins the beginning of the end of East Germany. You can see the Berlin Wall right here, and you can see the 2 sides. You can see the side with all the graffiti, that is the western side. And then on the other side, you can see East German guards standing behind where this wall has been destroyed. This would be a great moment in world history in 1989 and 1990 when people took to knocking it down. It became a cool artifact or a souvenir to have if you had a piece of the Berlin Wall. So when the wall started to come down, this starts the formal reunification of Germany. So we end with really a perfect storm for the Soviet Union in a bad way. And that is the Soviets were losing in Afghanistan. They were facing incredible pressures from Eastern Europe. And their leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, was trying to change everything, hopefully for the better. Gorbachev's ideas were fantastic. He won Times Man of the Year award. He was very, very famous outside of the USSR. And he was famous because he was trying to give the people more rights and more freedoms and trying to turn around a struggling economy. So the ideas were good. However, the execution of these ideas were not. And so the execution simply failed, and things actually got worse in Russia before they got better. The problem with someone like Gorbachev is that he's in a tough position. Since he followed a regime that offered almost no freedoms, and he offered some freedoms, he would be criticized from two different directions. Not one direction, but from two directions. On one side, you have the military and the conservatives who believe that he's making too many changes, and they would rather go back to to the days of Stalin because that's what they're comfortable with. On the other side, you have liberals who believe that the reforms that Gorbachev has passed are simply the beginning, meaning they criticize him for not going far enough. They want even more change. So on one side, people hate him because he's made too much change. On the other side, because he hasn't made enough change. At least we got a Pizza Hut commercial out of it.
Горбачев, из-за него мы на краю экономической пропасти.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Из-за него мы на краю политического хаоса.
Благодаря ему мы теперь свободны. И можем дойти до края этой пиццы.
The Edge Pizza from Pizza Hut with no outer crust, so the toppings go all the way to the edge.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева! За Горбачева!
Have you been to the Edge?
That was actually Gorbachev in that commercial. And you can really see that some people love him for giving freedoms to them. Others hate him because the changes he made actually made the economy even worse. Because of Gorbachev, you really have the end of the Soviet Union, which is not what he wanted. He just wanted to make it friendlier. In 1991, when Gorbachev was away on a vacation, there's a military uprising, a coup d'etat in Moscow that threatened to put the military back in charge. And again, this would be a victory for conservatives because they wanted to go back to the days of Stalin. The problem for Gorbachev is that he was away on vacation and they actually detained him at his little villa or dacha, and he was unable to get back to Moscow. So instead, there's this guy called Boris Yeltsin, who's the president of Russia. By 1991, Gorbachev is the president of the Soviet Union, which is Russia plus the 14 other republics. Boris Yeltsin is the president of Russia. And so Yeltsin jumps to the charge and actually jumps up on a military tank, and he gives this intense speech saying, "We will not back down against the military." And so this military coup is really defeated by Yeltsin and the people of Moscow. Now, Yeltsin is more liberal than Gorbachev, and so Yeltsin is one of the people who are criticizing him, Gorbachev, because he wanted more change. This would be really the beginning of the end for Gorbachev. When Gorbachev comes back to Moscow, he finds that now more and more people are following Yeltsin and supporting Yeltsin, who is promising further reforms and changes, and he is the hero who saved the day against the evil military. And so Gorbachev will transfer power to Yeltsin in December of 1991. I believe it's actually on Christmas Day that the Soviet Union formally dissolves. And so this is the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapsed by the end of 1991, and what will follow is simply called the Russian Federation, which is what Russia is still called today. So this is the map of Russia today. As you can see, it's much smaller than that of the Soviet Union. Remember, you used to have in the USSR Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. So now all of this land is free. So these are 14 free countries now, plus Russia. Thank you very much, and have a great day.